What have I done? What is this?
He spent more than a decade building a financial structure his wife was never supposed to find. Limited liability companies registered in other people's names. Income layered through corporate entities so deliberately complicated that even his own attorneys needed a diagram to follow the money. He was certain, absolutely certain, that when the divorce finally arrived, his wife would sit across that conference table, accept what he placed in front of her, and walk away grateful for whatever he decided she deserved. He was wrong. The proof of exactly how wrong he was arrived in a sealed white envelope that his own attorney opened, read for 45 seconds, and then placed face down on the table without saying a word. What was inside that envelope? And why, after finding every single dollar that her husband had spent 11 years hiding, did Diane Holt ask for none of it? Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Warren Holt grew up in Cobb County, Georgia, the second son of a man who measured worth in property and in the accumulation of things that could be counted, appraised, and compared to what other men had. That inheritance, the belief that a man's value is determined entirely by what he controls, did not arrive through any single conversation or lesson. It arrived the way most of a father's worst ideas arrive in his children, through observation, through the texture of daily life, through the slow absorption of a worldview that feels, by the time you are old enough to question it, so deeply internal that it no longer seems like a worldview at all. It seems like reality. Warren Holt absorbed that belief early, carried it through his 20s, and by the time he was in his mid-30s, had built something that appeared, to anyone observing from the outside, to confirm it entirely. His real estate development company was incorporated in the late 1980s, a period when the Atlanta metropolitan area was beginning the economic expansion that would accelerate dramatically through the 1990s and position the city as one of the most significant commercial real estate markets in the American South. Cobb County, northwest of Atlanta's city center, was itself in the middle of a sustained growth period. Commercial corridors were expanding. Residential developments were spreading outward from older neighborhood cores. Infrastructure spending was reshaping transit connections. For a man in real estate development who had access to capital, understood the local political relationships that governed zoning and permitting, and was willing to move aggressively on opportunities before they became visible to competitors, the Atlanta market in that era was about as favorable an environment as the industry ever produces. Warren understood that environment intuitively. He moved inside it with a confidence that people who worked with him in those years described, consistently, as the kind of confidence that is very useful right up until the moment it isn't. Diane Holt had come into that same world through a different door. She had studied accounting at a university in Georgia, and by the time she completed her degree, she had developed a quality of financial perception that her professors noted and that her first employer, a commercial property firm in Atlanta, immediately put to use. She was not just accurate with numbers. She was attentive to what numbers implied when read in relation to one another, to what a financial document communicated not only through what it stated, but through what it chose not to state, through what was absent, through what was structured to be overlooked. That particular skill, the capacity to read financial information for its silences as much as its contents, is not common, and it is not taught directly. It is a quality of mind, and Diane had it fully formed by the time she was 24 years old. She met Warren at a real estate conference in Atlanta in the early 1990s. She was attending as a junior analyst representing her firm. He was attending as a speaker, positioned on the program as a rising figure in Cobb County commercial development. By the end of the weekend, he had her phone number. By the end of the following month, he had her full attention, which in Diane's case was not a small thing to have. People who knew her then described her as someone who gave her attention precisely and deliberately, who was not easily impressed, and who had a quality of watchfulness in social situations that could read as reserve but was actually something closer to assessment. She was assessing Warren. He, by his own later account, believed he was impressing her. Both things were probably true, which is how most consequential mistakes begin. They married in the early 1990s. The arrangement that followed Diane stepping away from her career at the firm to manage the household and eventually to raise their 2 children was presented at the time as practical. Warren's business was growing. His schedule was demanding. The social obligations that attended a rising figure in the Atlanta real estate community required a capable and presentable partner, and Diane was both of those things. She agreed to the arrangement without, by any account, any particular objection. What people who knew her in those years observed, looking back, is that Diane did not object to things she found unsuitable. She made note of them. There is a distinction between those two responses, and in the case of Diane Holt, that distinction would eventually turn out to matter enormously. Managing the household finances for a real estate developer is not the same as managing household finances for most other professionals. The money that moved through the Holt household from the early years of their marriage was not simple money. There were income streams from multiple properties at different stages of development. There were operating accounts for the business that intersected with the household budget in ways that were not always clearly defined. There were tax documents, quarterly financial reports, correspondence from accountants and attorneys and business partners, all of which arrived at the house and all of which Diane, as the household's administrative manager, had routine and legitimate access to. She was not, in those early years, looking for anything specific. But she was, by the trained habit of her particular intelligence, reading everything that came across her desk with the same quality of attention she had brought to financial documents when she was being paid to do exactly that. The marriage produced 2 children, and the external shape of the Holt family life in the late 1990s and early 2000s was what Cobb County in that era reliably produced among families of their income and social standing. They attended church. They were involved in the neighborhood association. They appeared at the school functions and the local charity events and the business community dinners that marked the rhythm of suburban Atlanta professional life. Warren was well regarded. Diane was well liked. Their home was comfortable and well maintained. The surface was entirely convincing. But the people who knew Diane most closely in those years, the women who were her genuine friends rather than her social acquaintances, said something about her that is worth noting. They said she always seemed to be thinking about something she was not saying. That observation, which seemed at the time like a personality trait, turns out to have been an accurate description of exactly what was happening. Somewhere around 2004 and 2005, the texture of the Holt marriage began to change in ways that were perceptible to people close to them, even if no one named it directly. Warren was traveling more. He was less present at home. His professional life had expanded into larger and more complex development projects that required his attention in ways that left progressively less of it available for the life happening inside his own house. The children were entering adolescence, a stage of development that demands engaged, present parenting, and the parent who was providing most of that engagement was Diane. She was also, during this same period, managing increasing social obligations alone, attending events as a representative of a partnership that was, in the practical daily reality of their lives, becoming less of a partnership and more of a title that one of them was maintaining and the other was drifting away from. She carried this without visible complaint. She became, if anything, quieter. What Diane noticed around this time, the observation that began moving her attention from the general awareness she had always maintained to something more focused and deliberate, she has never publicly specified in detail. What is clear from the pattern of her subsequent decisions is that it was financial in nature. Something in the documents she had routine access to did not align with something else she knew or observed. A number that should have followed from another number did not. An account that should have reflected a certain level of activity showed something different. The specific discrepancy is not the important part of this. The important part is what Diane did with it. She did not ask Warren about it. She did not call an attorney. She did not tell her friends. She sat with what she had noticed, turned it over in the financial mind she had spent years developing, and decided that before she did anything at all, she needed to understand the full picture. In early 2007, Diane hired a forensic accountant, not a divorce attorney, not a private investigator. A forensic accountant, a professional whose entire expertise is built around locating money that has been deliberately structured to appear as though it does not exist. The distinction matters. A divorce attorney is oriented toward legal proceedings. A forensic accountant is oriented toward financial truth, toward tracing the movement of money through layered corporate structures, identifying the gaps between what a financial disclosure states and what the underlying documents actually show, and producing a documented record of findings that can withstand examination in a legal setting. Diane did not yet know whether she would ever be in a legal setting. She knew she needed the truth about the numbers. She started there. She paid for the engagement from a personal account she had maintained under her maiden name since the mid-1990s, an account that Warren had no visibility into and no reason to look for. She made no calls about this from any shared line. She sent no emails from any account Warren could access. She conducted the entire engagement through channels that existed entirely outside any part of their shared life. A forensic accountant she retained began his investigation with the financial documentation that Diane provided, tax returns, business records, the documents she had legitimate access to as the household's administrative manager, and began the process of following the money that those documents suggested, but did not fully explain. It would take him 14 months to complete his work. Diane waited. She continued managing the household. She continued attending the neighborhood association meetings. She continued being, to every outward appearance, exactly the person she had always been. What the forensic accountant found at the end of those 14 months was a financial architecture of genuine complexity. Beginning in the late 1990s, Warren had been systematically routing portions of income from his development projects through a series of limited liability companies that did not appear on any joint financial document, were not connected to any account Diane had access to, and were registered using the names of business associates whose actual operational involvement in Warren's projects was, upon examination, minimal. The structure followed a pattern that forensic accountants who work in divorce cases encounter with enough regularity that they have a specific term for it: layering. Income moves from a primary business entity into a secondary LLC, then into a tertiary structure, and by the time it completes that journey, it is practically invisible to anyone who is only looking at the top level of the financial picture. Warren had been running this structure for nearly a decade by the time Diane's forensic accountant began mapping it. The accountant's completed report estimated, conservatively, that the assets Warren had routed through this structure and held outside the visible marital estate totaled between $4 and $6 million. This was separate from the assets that existed in the shared financial picture: the family home, 2 investment properties, and the operating accounts of Warren's primary company. The report also documented something that carried significant legal weight. The manner in which the LLC structure had been maintained required Warren to have submitted financial documents over the years that were materially inaccurate representations of his actual financial position. Under Georgia law, both parties to a divorce proceeding are required to file a domestic relations financial affidavit, a sworn statement, signed and notarized, that discloses all assets, all sources of income, and all debts. Filing that affidavit with false or omitted information is not a civil violation. It is perjury. Warren did not yet know that his wife had a 14-month forensic record of everything. Diane read the completed report privately. She has described her reaction to its contents as something closer to clarity than shock. She had suspected something in the approximate range of what the accountant had found, which is precisely why she had commissioned the work. What the report gave her was not new information so much as documented confirmation of information she had been carrying privately for 2 years. She set the report down. She did not immediately call an attorney. She did not confront Warren. She did not tell her children, her friends, or anyone else in her life what she had found. Instead, she did something that is genuinely difficult to appreciate if you're thinking about this story as most people initially think about it, as a story about a betrayed spouse pursuing justice through the legal system. Diane sat with the report and began thinking not about how to use what she had found to take, but about what she actually wanted the outcome to be. Those are very different questions, and the gap between them is where her real strategy began to take shape. She spent approximately 3 months after receiving the report in what might be described as a planning period, though that word is almost too mild for what she was actually doing. During those 3 months, she consulted with a Georgia family law attorney, not to initiate divorce proceedings, but to ask a very specific set of questions. She wanted to understand, precisely and technically, what documentation would be required for a Georgia court to find that a party had committed fraud on the court through a materially false financial affidavit. She wanted to understand the legal consequences that could follow from such a finding, the sanctions available to a judge, the potential for criminal referral, the exposure that a finding of perjury in a civil proceeding creates for the individual who committed it. She also wanted to understand something more specific still. She wanted to know whether there was a legal mechanism by which the assets she had documented could be directed toward a particular purpose, rather than simply awarded to her as a component of marital property division. She was not asking how to take the money. She was asking whether she could control where it went. In the spring of 2008, Diane told Warren she wanted a divorce. The conversation, by all accounts of people familiar with what was said, was brief. Warren did not appear surprised. He may not have been. The distance between them had been accumulating for years, and whatever Warren's private understanding of the state of their marriage was, he processed Diane's request with the speed of someone who had already, at some level, anticipated it. Within hours of that conversation, he was on the phone with his attorneys. Within days, his legal team had begun assembling what would become his financial disclosure package for the divorce proceedings, a package that, as Warren understood it, would reflect the assets Diane knew about and nothing beyond them. He believed the LLC structure was secure. He believed his financial architecture was invisible to her. He believed, above all, that Diane's intelligence, which he had never fully discounted, exactly, but had also never genuinely reckoned with, had not extended itself into the corners of his financial life, where the most important things were hidden. He was operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of who his wife was. The formal divorce proceedings began in January of 2009. Georgia is an equitable distribution state, governed by statute under the Official Code of Georgia Section 19513, which means that marital assets are divided fairly rather than automatically equally, with the court considering factors that include the length of the marriage, each spouse's contributions to the marital estate, and each party's economic circumstances going forward. Warren's legal team entered the proceedings with a financial disclosure package they had structured carefully. It disclosed the family home, the 2 investment properties, the retirement accounts, and the operating accounts of the primary business. It was, on its surface, a comprehensive document. It did not disclose the LLCs. It did not disclose the income that had been routed through them. It did not disclose the $4 to $6 million that the forensic accountant had spent 14 months documenting. Under Georgia's Uniform Superior Court Rule 24.2, that disclosure was submitted as a sworn statement, signed, notarized, and filed with the court. Warren signed it. Georgia's mandatory discovery requirements in divorce proceedings are specific and substantial. Both parties are required to produce tax returns, bank statements, credit card records, and business ledgers. Both parties are required to answer interrogatories under oath. The domestic relations financial affidavit that each party submits is not a courtesy document. It is testimony, and the courts treat it as such. What this means in practice is that when a party submits a financial affidavit that omits $4 to $6 million in assets rooted through an undisclosed corporate structure, that party has not merely failed to be forthcoming. They have committed perjury in a civil proceeding. The exposure that creates, the sanctions available to the court, the potential for criminal referral, the devastation to a professional reputation built over 3 decades in a community where reputation is the foundation of every deal, is not theoretical. It is real, it is substantial, and it is exactly what Diane's attorney had explained to her in detail during the 3 months she spent planning after the forensic report landed on her desk. Diane's legal team reviewed Warren's financial disclosure package the evening before the scheduled mediation session. Her attorney called her at home. He told her the package looked thorough. Diane told him it was not. She told him what she had the 14 months of forensic work, the documented LLC structure, the estimated asset total, the paper trail that connected every dollar back to Warren regardless of what name was on the LLC registration. Her attorney was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her how long she had been sitting on this. She told him. He was quiet again. When he spoke, he said something that Diane later recounted to people close to her, paraphrased. He told her that with what she had, she could file a motion to have Warren's accounts frozen before the mediation session even began. She could go to the court with a finding of fraud on the sworn financial disclosure. She could, if she chose, take this situation public in a way that would be professionally catastrophic for Warren in the Cobb County business community. She told her attorney she was not going to do any of those things. She told him what she was going to do instead. He listened. Then he told her he had been practicing family law for over 20 years, and he had never heard a proposal quite like the one she had just described. The mediation session was scheduled for the morning of April 14, 2009, in a conference room at a law office in the Atlanta metropolitan area. Warren arrived with 2 attorneys from a respected Marietta family law firm. They arrived, by the accounts of people familiar with the session, with the measured confidence of a legal team that believes its preparation is complete and its position is solid. Their financial disclosure package was 3 inches thick. Their settlement offer had been carefully structured to appear generous within the boundaries of what they believed Diane knew. They were prepared for a negotiation. They were prepared for counteroffers, for disputed property valuations, for arguments about the business account figures and the investment property appraisals. They were not prepared for what happened when the session began. Diane arrived with 1 attorney and a sealed white envelope. Her attorney did not open the proceedings with a counteroffer. He did not present an alternative financial package. He did not challenge the valuations in Warren's disclosure or dispute the business account figures. He picked up the sealed envelope and slid it across the conference table. He said, simply, that his client had a proposal she believed all parties would find worth considering before any further discussion took place. Warren's lead attorney picked up the envelope. He opened it. He read what was inside for approximately 45 seconds. Then he placed the document face down on the table, looked at his colleague, and asked the mediator for a recess. Warren, watching his own attorney's face during those 45 seconds, later said it was the first time in 30 years of working with lawyers that he could not read what an attorney's expression meant. The recess lasted just under an hour. Warren and his 2 attorneys went to a separate room. Diane and her attorney stayed at the conference table. Diane, by her own account, poured herself a cup of coffee and read a magazine she had brought with her. She was not nervous. She had spent 2 years and 3 months preparing for this morning, and the particular quality of 2 years of preparation is that it does not leave much room for anxiety on the day. The waiting, for Diane, was simply the last phase of a process that had already been completed. Everything that needed to be done had been done. Everything that needed to be documented had been documented. Everything that needed to be understood had been understood, and understood thoroughly, by every person in that building except the one sitting in the room next door with 2 attorneys who were, for the first time in this entire proceeding, operating without the advantage they believed they had walked in with. What was in the envelope was not a legal motion. It was not a court filing. It was not a threat, at least not in the explicit sense of that word. The envelope contained a 2-page document. The first page was a precise, sourced summary of the forensic accountant's findings. It identified the LLC structure by name. It documented the estimated total of the assets routed through it. It included the names of the individuals whose identities had been used in the company registrations and the dates of those registrations. It cross-referenced specific line items in Warren's sworn financial affidavit against the documented reality of his actual financial position. It was, in effect, a complete and organized record of a fraud committed under oath. The first page did not need to say what it implied. Anyone reading it understood immediately what it meant for Warren's legal exposure if it was ever presented to a judge. The first page was not Diane's proposal. The first page was the context for understanding why her proposal, on the second page, was the most favorable option Warren was going to be offered. The second page was a single paragraph. It was Diane's proposal. She was not asking for the hidden assets. She was not threatening to take the forensic findings to the court. She was not asking Warren to sign a revised financial affidavit that disclosed the LLC structure to the judge. She was making an offer, and the offer had one condition. Diane would sign a final divorce settlement accepting exactly what Warren had already put on the table: the family home, the agreed alimony structure, and the lump sum his attorneys had prepared, with one addition. Warren would use the assets held in the LLC structure, the $4 to $6 million he had rooted outside the marital estate over 11 years, to establish a fully funded, legally structured, irrevocable educational trust for their 2 children. Not a contribution toward college savings, not a promise, an irrevocable trust, a legal structure that, once established, cannot be undone, cannot be redirected, cannot be accessed by Warren, cannot be reached by any future creditor, and exists for one purpose only: to fund the educational and professional development of both of their children, for as long as either of them has educational or professional needs to fund. She did not want the money. She wanted it to be permanently, legally, and unambiguously untouchable. By Warren. By anyone except their children. The word irrevocable is a specific legal term, and it carries a specific legal weight that is worth understanding in the context of what Diane was proposing. An irrevocable trust, once executed, transfers assets out of the grantor's control permanently. The grantor, in this case, Warren, gives up all legal rights to the assets placed in the trust. He cannot change his mind. He cannot redirect the funds. He cannot, under any circumstance, access what he places inside it. What Diane was asking Warren to do was to take the money he had spent 11 years hiding from her and from their children, the money he had structured so carefully to be invisible, and place it somewhere where it would be not only visible but permanent and unassailable, and where its sole beneficiaries would be the 2 people whose financial futures he had been, in effect, compromising with every dollar he had rooted into that structure rather than into the life they shared. Warren's attorneys needed the full recess and a portion of a second recess to work through the implications of what Diane had placed on that table. The mathematics of his situation were not complicated, but they were stark. Option 1. Reject Diane's proposal, proceed with the mediation using the financial disclosure he had submitted, and risk the possibility that Diane's attorney would take the forensic findings to the court. At which point, a judge would be looking at a sworn financial affidavit with a documented $4 to $6 million omission, which under Georgia law constituted fraud on the court and potentially perjury, with consequences that included sanctions, potential criminal referral, and the kind of public legal proceeding in Cobb County's business community that 30 years of professional reputation cannot survive intact. Option 2. Accept Diane's proposal, fund the irrevocable trust, finalize the divorce on the terms already on the table, and walk out of that building with his professional reputation, his primary business, his investment properties, and his freedom, all of which remained entirely intact under the terms of what his wife was offering him. The attorneys advised option 2. Warren, after the better part of 2 hours, agreed. The trust was established within 60 days of the mediation session. Both parties' attorneys worked to structure it correctly. The assets transferred in, the trustee named, the terms documented, the irrevocable nature of the instrument confirmed under Georgia law. The divorce was finalized through a settlement agreement that did not require a trial, did not result in any public court proceeding, and did not produce any public record of the LLC discovery or the forensic findings. Warren's financial disclosure irregularities were never presented to a judge. His professional reputation in the Atlanta business community was never publicly touched. Diane signed the settlement agreement, signed the trust document as the co-establishing parent, watched both documents executed, and then walked out of the conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 2009 with exactly what she had planned to walk out with: a finalized divorce, a funded irrevocable trust in her children's names, and not one extra dollar in her own pocket beyond what Warren had offered before she ever slid that envelope across the table. A person who was present in the building that day, not in the conference room but in the larger office, said that when Diane came out, she looked exactly the same as she had looked coming in that morning. Same composure, same unhurried walk, same quality of self-possession that people had been describing when they talked about her for 30 years. She stopped at the reception desk to retrieve her coat. She thanked the receptionist. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. The doors opened. She stepped in. And that was the last time anyone connected with the Warren Holt divorce proceeding saw Diane Holt in a legal context. The question that lives inside this story, the one that is impossible to fully answer and probably worth sitting with rather than resolving quickly, is not about the money. It was never about the money, not for Diane. The question is about the nature of the choice she made and what it reveals about how she understood her situation. She had documentation that could have ended Warren's professional life. She had legal leverage that virtually every attorney she could have consulted would have advised her to use in her own financial interest. She could have walked out of that proceeding with potentially twice what she accepted. She chose, instead, to use everything she had found and everything she had built to secure one specific outcome, one that had nothing to do with her own financial position and everything to do with her children's futures. And she structured that outcome in such a way that no subsequent decision by Warren, no future financial difficulty, no change of heart could ever undo it. What she built in that conference room on that April morning was not a divorce settlement. It was a fortress around her children's futures, constructed from the very money that had been hidden from them, made permanent by the one legal mechanism that Warren could not later reach into and take back. There is also something worth examining in what Diane chose not to do. She did not expose Warren publicly. She did not pursue the perjury angle in a way that would have criminally endangered him. She did not use the mediation to humiliate him in front of his own attorneys, though she had every instrument available to do exactly that. People who know Diane well say her explanation for these choices has always been consistent. She was not protecting Warren. She was protecting her children. A father in prison or in the middle of a public financial scandal is not a better father for the children who still have to live alongside the consequences of that. A professional reputation that collapses publicly takes years to recover, if it recovers at all. And a financially collapsed Warren was a Warren who would be less able to participate in his children's lives going forward. She did not want Warren to suffer the consequences he arguably deserved. She wanted her children to have what they deserved. She had found a way to accomplish one without requiring the other, and she took it. Diane Holt returned to work in 2011. She completed a law degree at a Georgia university in 2015 and opened a family law practice in Atlanta focused on financial disclosure and asset recovery in divorce proceedings. She has never spoken publicly about the specifics of her own case. Her children, by all available accounts, pursued their education and their professional paths without the burden of debt that marks the beginning of so many young American careers. Warren Holt relocated his primary business operations to a neighboring county in the years following the divorce. What became of the LLC structure, whether it was fully dissolved, restructured, or simply wound down, is not publicly known. What is known is that both of the Holt children completed their degrees, and that the money that paid for those degrees was the same money that had once been structured, very carefully, to make sure their mother would never find it. The thing about this story that stays with people, once they have heard all of it, is not the forensic investigation, as methodical as that was. It is not the envelope, as cinematic as that moment turned out to be. It is not even the irrevocable trust, as legally precise and strategically elegant as that instrument proved to be. What stays with people is a simpler image. A woman who spent 14 years of her professional life setting aside the career she was trained for, managing the household and the social calendar, and the administrative life of a man who was, quietly and systematically, routing millions of dollars into a structure designed to make sure she would never be able to claim her fair share of it. A woman who noticed. A woman who said nothing. A woman who waited 2 years, hired the right professional, read every page of a 14-month forensic investigation, consulted an attorney, designed a legal instrument, placed it in an envelope, sat across a conference table from 2 attorneys and a man who had never once credited her with being capable of exactly what she had just done, slid that envelope across the mahogany, and waited again. She had been waiting for years. 45 seconds more was nothing. If you could sit across from Diane Holt today and ask her one question about that morning, what would it be? Because here is what I keep coming back to. At any point in those 2 years of preparation, she could have stopped. She could have filed for divorce the day she hired the forensic accountant. She could have taken the report straight to an attorney and let the legal process run its full course. She could have confronted Warren directly the night she first noticed the discrepancy. She did none of those things. She waited until she had everything she needed to make the outcome she wanted. Not the largest possible financial settlement, not the most publicly damaging exposure of her husband's fraud, but the specific outcome she had decided on, not just possible, but certain. That is not patience in the ordinary sense of the word. That is something more architectural. That is someone who understood that the difference between what you could take and what you want to build is the most important strategic distinction you will ever make. And here is what I want to know from you today. If you were sitting in that conference room as a neutral observer, not as Diane, not as Warren, not as either of their attorneys, and you watched that envelope slide across the table, and you knew what was inside it, what do you think you would have advised Diane to do? Take the full legal route and pursue every dollar she was entitled to in court. Or do exactly what she did, use what she had found to secure something permanent and protected for her children, and walk away with her composure intact and Warren's secret still technically her secret. Leave me your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. And this one, do you think the children ever found out where the money in that trust actually came from? Because that question has a complicated answer, and it is one I think about every time I revisit this story. Next time, we are looking at a case where a prenuptial agreement that 3 separate attorneys called airtight turned out to contain one clause, one single overlooked clause, that a judge described as the most consequential drafting error he had encountered in 31 years on the bench. You will not want to miss that one. Subscribe so it comes straight to you the moment it goes live. And thank you genuinely for watching this one all the way to the end. Stories like Diane's deserve to be heard in full. I am glad you stayed.